Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to PsychoBible, babbling about psychology and theology, and sometimes about film. So, this is going to be one of my videos in the PsychoBible cinema category. Over the weekend, I just watched The Tomorrow War, starring Chris Pratt on Amazon Prime. I really liked it. It's a shame it wasn't released in theaters. I know apparently it was supposed to be released, and then COVID happened. Um, but it was pretty good. There's some corny stuff in it. There's some uh, like plot device tropes that are kind of cliche. That like the expert has to go to someone who really is inexperienced in life but happens to know a lot about one thing, and there's a lot of heavy foreshadowing in the beginning of the film. So they connect it all together later. So yeah, there's some flaws in it. But it's a pretty clean movie as well. No sex, nudity, very minimal profanity. And there's actually some very strong symbolic elements in this movie. So, I really want to talk about the symbolism in the Tomorrow War. That means I'm going to just pretty much give away the whole plot. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, you might as well stop now, unless you have zero interest in watching the movie, because I'm just going to give away the whole thing. So, spoiler alert. Now, if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson, you'll notice a very clear symbolic pattern. I don't know anything about the writers or the director, but watching this movie, I was like, oh my gosh, are these guys listening to Jordan Peterson lectures or something? Because they are hitting on so many Jordan Peterson's favorite myths and symbolic themes. It's astounding. If you're familiar with Jordan Peterson, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So in the movie, you got this guy, Dan Forrester, who is a military vet, who also is a scientist, and he's trying to get a career in a lab and really do something significant with his life, and he's just constantly kind of frustrated, being held back. So he's working as a high school science teacher, I think biology, and he's got a wife and he has a daughter, and he loves them to death, but he's very ambitious. He's determined to make something of himself. Okay? Then, it's like during Christmas time, all of a sudden, during like the World Cup or something, this portal opens up, and these humans from about 30 years in the future arrive, and they tell everyone that they came from a war in the future where there are these aliens wiping out the whole human race, and they're down to like a small remnant. And their final hope is to use this time portal that they created. Now, it only creates a wormhole from their time to 30 years prior. And they don't have the ability to create more time portals, and they can't go back further in time. So it's just for that period of time, conveniently. And so they make the plea, we're going to you, our fathers and grandfathers, to come to the future with us to fight for our existence. Now, if you're into politics, you might be seeing this and thinking, okay, this is clearly an analogy of the climate crisis. That our very existence depends on you guys in the present making decisions to save our future. And maybe that's what the writers were intending. But like I was saying, I'm sensing some deeper mythological patterns in this story. So they begin setting up a system of enlisting soldiers from present day to go into the future and serve tours in the future and fight these aliens that are like ravishing and just destroying everything. And we jump ahead then a year later. So now it's been a year that they've been doing this partnership with the soldiers from the future, sending people into the future, sending them back. Now it's been a year doing this, and the world is just discouraged because only 30% of the soldiers that they send into the future ever return home. And they're traumatized, of course. And so there's a debate going on if it's even worth it to keep fighting. Why bother? So we're going to be wiped out anyway. There's nothing we can do. We're clearly ineffective. Why should we care about them? That's just the future. Do we even know that's how things are really going to go? So you see all this doubt, skepticism about this future threat, and ultimately nihilism, as people think it's meaningless. Well, what's the point in living a life now? It's all going to be wiped out in 30 years anyway. And so as the nihilism grows, riots grow, and the world just becomes more and more unstable. People's hearts grow cold. But they're still determined to keep this alliance with the future soldiers going, so the whole world institutes a draft, a worldwide draft, and because they're running low on reinforcements. And this is one thing we find out when Dan Forrester gets drafted, because they don't make it clear how you get drafted. All right, but real quick, once he gets drafted, his wife does not want him to go because she knows how bad the results are. And even if he does come back, she sees how traumatized they are because she works with the people who come back, and she's like a therapist. And so she's like, no, we got to run. We got to get out of here. Now, when you get drafted, they graft this bracelet onto you that's like your time displacement device. It's the thing that'll actually send you through the portal. And they track you. And he's like, I can't just escape. I don't know how to run away from the government like this. And he's like, you do know someone. And it's apparently his dad, whom he's estranged from. His dad abandoned him when he was a kid, and his dad has been trying to reconnect with him, but he's been putting his dad off, or putting a barrier between him and his dad and his family. But his wife is like, he's the only one you know who could probably help us. He's apparently an engineer and can tinker with the bracelet. It's like, conveniently, his dad is an expert on this stuff. So he goes to see his dad, but he has a falling out with him again, they have another big blow up, and so he's like, no, forget it. I'm gonna be courageous. I'm not gonna run. I'm gonna be an example to my daughter and be brave. So he decides not to dodge the draft, and he goes forward with it. So when he got drafted, and he goes to the facility where he gets the bracelet put on him, he learns why people are selected for the draft. Only certain people are selected, and those whom, based on their future records, they can tell are going to die anyway prior to the alien invasion. And he finds out that in 7 years he dies. Now they don't tell him how he dies or what else happens in the in-between. They just tell him, 7 years you die. And that's why you're qualified for the draft. This perfectly fits one of Jordan Peterson's favorite myths, the one of Horus and Osiris, and also even Pinocchio.
All right, anyways, you need to know the characters. Osiris. Osiris is the old king. He's Dumbledore for all intents and purposes. He's the old king. He's the spirit that established the Egyptian state when he was young. He was a great hero, but now he's old. And he's archaic, and he's willfully blind. That's Osiris. He has a brother, Seth. Seth is Set, and Set is Satan, because the word Satan comes from the word Seth and Set via the Coptic Christians. So he's a precursor to the Western idea of Satan. You have Isis. Isis is queen of the underworld, and Isis was the goddess of a religious structure that prevailed across thousands and thousands of years. Isis. And you have Horus. Horus is a falcon, and the Egyptian eye. Everyone knows that eye, right? The eye with the open pupil. That's Horus. And Horus is a falcon because falcons can see way better. They can see better than us. They can see better than anything else except for perhaps eagles. And they fly above everything. Osiris, Seth, Isis, and Horus. Here's how the story goes. Osiris is a great king. He established the Egyptian state. You could think about him as the embodiment of Egyptian custom and tradition. You could think about him as the thing that the pyramid represents. All right? But he was great when he was young, but he's not young anymore. He's old, and he's willfully blind. And what that means is that he doesn't see what he could see. He refuses to see what he could see. Why is Osiris old and willfully blind? Because that's what culture is. It's a paternal spirit that's old and willfully blind, and it's always that way, always that way. And the reason for that is because it's a construction of the dead. The dead aren't alive, they can't, so they're out of date, and they can't update themselves anymore. And you inhabit their corpse, and that's actually what happens in an earlier story that I'll tell you next week. The early Mesopotamian gods inhabited the corpse of their father, roughly speaking. Anyway, so Osiris was great and when he was young, but he isn't young anymore. He's old and he's willfully blind. He won't look where he knows he should look. He doesn't have the energy, or maybe he doesn't have the spirit. His brother Seth is not a good guy. And Osiris knows it, but he underestimates his malevolence and power. And so Seth wants to rule the kingdom. So what does that mean? It's easy. Every stable society is threatened by willful blindness and malevolence. Always. Every bureaucracy has that proclivity to stagnate and to become blind. That's why corporations die all the time. That's why a Fortune 500 company only lasts 30 years. It's why we have to have elections. It's to stop the dead from staying in control for too long. Osiris turns a blind eye to Seth. Seth is happy about it. The same thing happens in the Lion King, roughly speaking. Seth one day waits for Osiris to make a mistake and to be weak, and he attacks him and he chops him up into pieces. And he distributes the pieces across the entire Egyptian state. In fact, the Egyptians regarded their provinces as pieces of Osiris's body. Okay, so now you can't kill Osiris because he's a god. And why is he God? A god because he represents the spirit of structure. And there's always structure. It can't be destroyed. It always reconstitutes itself. It can be hurt and broken into pieces, which is exactly what happens to Osiris. Things fall apart. Why? Because they get old and because malevolence undermines them. That's what the Egyptians were trying to sort out. Okay, so Seth distributes his Osiris all over Egypt so he can't get himself back together. Right? Things fall apart and they can't be brought back together. But the spirit of Osiris still lives in the pieces. So what happens? Order is demolished. What would you expect? Chaos emerges. That's Isis. Isis is queen of the underworld. She's Osiris's wife. Order and chaos, just like the yin and the yang. Order collapses, up comes the queen of the underworld. She's looking for order. Chaos cries out for order. She's looking for order. She goes all around Egypt trying to put Osiris back together. It's a state of chaos. She finds his phallus. She makes herself pregnant with it. And what does that mean? Well, it means it's like Geppetto in the belly of the whale. That thing has the potential to reemerge. The thing that collapses into its pieces is still alive. It can unite with the chaos and produce something new. That's the story of the dissolution of structure into chaos and then its revivification. Isis makes herself pregnant. She goes back down to the underworld. She gives birth to Horus. Horus is the Egyptian eye. He's the son of the great father and the great mother. He's a messianic figure. And in fact, much of the mythology that described Horus was extracted without much modification and then attributed to Christ. Very much, and you can read about the parallels. You can read about it online if you want. But there's any number of parallels. And of course, there is the mythology that the Jews came out of Egypt. And of course, the Christians emerged from the Jews. And so there was a tremendous influence of Egyptian thinking on the development of these later ideas. And you see pictures of Isis with Horus on her lap that are virtually identical in content and form to the later pictures of Mary with the infant Christ. And that's the holy mother of God in the hero. It's not a Christian motif. It's far deeper than a Christian motif. It's a human motif. So Isis, queen of the underworld, gives birth to Horus, and Horus grows up outside the kingdom. Why? In the underworld. Because that's what human beings do. You're alienated from your culture. Always. Why? It's old and dead and corrupt. And so that leaves you growing up in chaos. What would you call alienated from your fundamental culture. That's the story of adolescence. Horus grows up. He can see. That's what differentiates him from Osiris. That's why he's a falcon. He goes and has a fight with Seth. And now the difference between Osiris and Horus is that Horus does not underestimate Seth. He knows exactly what he's up against. He goes and has a terrible battle with him, trying to get his kingdom back. Something else that's echoed in the Lion King story. And while Horus and Osiris or Seth are fighting, Seth tears out one of his eyes. Now, why? Because Seth is the embodiment of destruction and malevolence, and no matter how conscious you are, if you encounter that, even voluntarily, the probability that it's going to damage your consciousness is extraordinarily high. That's why people don't do it. So the eye is torn out, but Seth is defeated, and Horus banishes him to the nether regions of the kingdom. You can't kill him. Why? Because the malevolent, destructive force that threatens states never dies. It's always there. You can only remove it temporarily. Now Horus is king. Pharaoh, king, God. He's got his eye, and so you think, well, he's going to just pop that back in his head, and then he's going to be able to lead. He's going to be able to take his place at the uppermost pantheon of gods properly. But that isn't what he does. He takes his eye and he goes back to the underworld, just like Pinocchio going into the depths to rescue Geppetto. And down there is the spirit of Osiris, who's extant as a kind of half-dead ghost. And he gives Osiris his eye. Now Osiris can see. So what does that mean? You go down into the chaotic, when threatened by malevolence, even to the point of damage to your consciousness. You go down into the chaos and you find the dead spirit of your tradition and you give it vision. And so, provided with vision, Osiris regenerates, and then Osiris and Horus go back up to the world, linked together and rule jointly. And the Egyptians believed that the Pharaoh, who had an immortal spirit, was the embodiment of the conjunction of Horus and Osiris. And that's what gave him sovereignty. And so you think about how brilliant that is. The Egyptians are trying to puzzle out who should lead, who should be Pharaoh, and what do you have to be if you're going to be Pharaoh in order for things to work. You have to be awake to malevolence and chaos, and you have to embody your tradition. And that puts you at the highest pinnacle of the dominant structure.
It's the myth of when the world is overrun by chaos and nihilism, you have to go back into the underworld and retrieve your dead father. Your father representing culture and tradition. And you need to bring him back. You need to resurrect your dead father and update him, kind of modify him and undergo a transformation so that you can be better suited to face the current threats. And so, essentially, that's what these future soldiers are doing. They're going back in the past to retrieve their own fathers in order to help them fight the present war. And literally, in their timeline, their fathers are dead. The ones they're drafting are already in the underworld, essentially, because they're going to die prior to the alien invasion. So he is pretty much a dead man. And he's being resurrected, brought into the future to help his children, or his child. And in fact, that's what ends up happening. When he goes into the future, he ends up working with his now adult daughter. His daughter Muri ends up becoming a scientist herself, and she starts the research division that is fighting the aliens and trying to come up with some sort of biological weapon against them. And so her plan was to develop the toxin that can kill both the aliens and the mother of the aliens. There's like a queen. Another Petersonian myth right there, that the chaos is represented in the feminine. And so, which is what got a lot of people triggered by Peterson. So the father represents culture, and nature and chaos is the mother. Now, there's positive and negative aspects of both. You can have a tyrannical father when culture becomes too rigid and authoritarian, and nature can be life-giving and beautiful, but at the same time, it can be dangerous and destructive. And that's what these aliens are. They just eat people, they just destroy everything, and they have a queen, they have a mother. So kind of like the devouring mother, right there represented there in the alien. Very similar to the Ridley Scott Aliens movies. So she has to develop a toxin that'll kill not just the regular aliens, but also the queen, which is very resistant to the other toxins she was developing. So her plan is to develop a toxin that can kill both, and then send her dad back into past before the aliens invaded to mass produce it, because they ran out of options. They don't have ways of mass producing things. In fact, they're on the verge of dying. Like, they're being invaded. And so the last research lab they have is about to be overrun. So that's what he does. Now, when he meets his daughter, he's surprised to find out that she has some sort of resentment against him. And she explains that what happens prior to his death, 7 years from the time that he went into the future, is prior to the invasion, of course. So the timelines now don't match either way. So kind of like, I won't get into it. They kind of disrupted the timeline by going back in the past. There's no way he would have fulfilled that history with this whole thing coming in there. But if they never had went back in time and created that portal, what would have happened is he would have gotten so disgruntled and discouraged by not being able to get a career in his field that he would have gotten depressed, and then it caused marital problems, and he left his wife and daughter, and then they got a divorce, and he just pretty much abandoned the family in much the same way that his own father abandoned the family. Okay? And so his daughter, now 30 years in the future, has resentment against him because he died in a car crash in a state of being estranged from her. And they never reconciled. And so he's like, I would never do that to you. But she's like, but you did. And so he has a wake-up call that he needs to get his life in order. He needs to straighten out his house. Before he can save the world, he needs to get his house in order. Very Petersonian. And through working together, they end up reconciling just before the aliens come and actually kill his daughter, and then he gets sent back in time because he only has a week before the time displacement device sends him back to 30 years prior. So he has a very limited time. They effectively make the toxin that will be able to kill both the aliens and the mother. He goes back in time. All right, he's traumatized. Like, he just saw his adult daughter die. So he's like, I gotta do something. Now that seems like the climax of the movie, and I thought that they're just going to have like one more scene real quick and it was going to wrap up, and they're going to do like a little montage showing that they mass produced it and they were prepared for the aliens when they arrived. But instead, when he gets back, he's talking to some others and like, we don't know where the arrival spot was. It was like they were already here. So in this final act, which seemed at first as I'm watching it, like, this really seems like a really long epilogue. But actually, there's even more symbolism in this final act. Especially for those of you who may be familiar with Jonathan Pageau, the Symbolic World, the Lore of Spirits podcast. If you listen to or read Michael Heiser, you'll be familiar with the symbolism that comes up in this final act. So, back in the present day, Dan now has a solution to save the future, but they need to determine where the invasion started. Now, one of the guys he went into the future with and who did multiple tours, he voluntarily went on multiple tours because he's like, hey, I'm going to die of cancer anyway, I'm going to keep going. I want to die on my terms. Well, he had taken back a claw from one of the aliens. So they study it and they see this volcanic ash in there. Now, of course, Dan has a student in his high school biology course who's like an expert on volcanoes. Like, they go to a high school student to find out where they should look for a volcano that might be where this ash came from, instead of going to some like actual geologist who would be like a real expert in this field. So this is what I'm talking about, some of the heavy foreshadowing and plot device cliches. But anyway, they determined that these aliens must have arrived sometime in like 900 something AD. So it's like over 1,000 years ago. And at the time, there was this big volcanic eruption in China/Korea, of all places. So you could say this plague, this disaster is wiping out the planet originated in China. I thought that was hilarious, in a way. Now, there was a ship apparently that these aliens were on, and got impacted by the volcanic eruption, and then it crash landed in Russia and got frozen inside this giant glacier. And the reason why they don't emerge until 30 years in the future is because that's when they finally, after like 1,000 years, thawed out. And then they went and started killing all the humans. Now, aliens in pop culture are clearly symbolic of heavenly beings. And in this case, especially as in the case of, like, say, Ridley Scott's Aliens movies, they're demonic. They're representative of demonic heavenly beings, fallen angels. And in biblical and Jewish tradition, fallen angels came to earth via mountains. We see this in the story of the sons of God who came down and corrupted mankind in Genesis 6. And we're given more details of this story in 1st Enoch. And they arrive via a mountain. In particular, it was Bashan or Mount Hermon. So this is like the mountain where the angels came down and they interacted with mankind and taught them all sorts of technology and pharmakia, how to make drugs, how to build weapons, and help expedite the corruption of mankind. And of course, then they intermarried with women and created the Nephilim and brought all these abominations upon the earth that led up to God wiping out mankind with the flood. But the Nephilim appeared later as well. So this practice of interacting with the demonic in certain rituals continued after the flood. We also see the mountain theme represented throughout other cultures when you see pyramids and ziggurats designed to look like mountains, because this is where the gods, or these fallen angels or demonic beings, would come down to interact with mankind. Okay? So now Dan, he goes and gets his own father, because his dad has a plane that he can use to go to this glacier in Russia, and because the government refuses to help them because things are just going too chaotic, and the president doesn't want to put his faith in this ragtag group. So there's a few people that gather together with Dan and his estranged father. So once again, there's that theme repeating itself of going back and retrieving your father from the underworld in order to face the threat. So it happened to Dan, now it's going to happen to Dan and his dad. And they go and explore the glacier, and they find where the aliens were. And they find that they had crash land in a ship. Now, when I'm watching the movie the whole time, I'm like, how do these aliens get here? These are like animalistic aliens. They don't have like much intelligence. So how did they get? You tell me that they created their own spaceship and traveled here? It would only make sense if they landed here like on a meteor, and they were like microorganisms at first, and then they grew bigger. But no, they were actually the cargo of an alien ship piloted by a more intelligent species, and likely they used these aliens to wipe out the planet before they could take over. And I saw that, and that's a good reminder that behind the monstrosities and chaos that we see destroying our world is a conniving, intelligent force, an enemy who knows us well, and will send in monsters and chaos to wipe us out so that he can take over. So it's actually quite fitting with the biblical narrative. But in the finale, Dan and his dad kill the mother alien, and they do it in a very unique way, in that they have the toxin, but the mother is very powerful, and it gives them a real fight. And so at one point, Dan has to take on the alien, and he blinds her. And so she can't see what she's doing, and his dad is about to go and sacrifice himself to kill her. And Dan goes and jumps in to save his dad from sacrificing himself. They both are being willing to sacrifice themselves to defeat the threat. It's that self-sacrifice, that willingness to lay down your life for your family, that ultimately is what saves them. And so with the threat eliminated, also it's funny, with blinding the mother it's kind of an inversion of another Petersonian trope about how what it takes to take on chaos is to have vision. We see this in Horus, the Horus and Osiris myth. Horus, who's represented as a falcon in Egyptian mythology, he has eyes that can see through anything, and it can see into the underworld. And so he's got great vision. And we see this in the myth of Marduk, in the Mesopotamian creation myth. So Marduk has eyes all over him. So he's got great insight that enables him to defeat Tiamat. Okay? So in order to defeat the threat around you that's destroying your civilization, you need to have vision. As Scripture says, those without vision will perish. Okay, my people perish for lack of vision. So we need to have vision, and then we can be strategic. All right. So it's very cool that they included that aspect. It's you need vision, and so the mother is defeated by taking away her vision. And ultimately, what I see is that this is a story about how restoring the family is the solution to the enemy's plan of chaos and nihilism. This fits so many of the things that Peterson talks about, but also just basic fundamental biblical truths. That we need to go back to what is the most basic representation of who God is and who we are and our destiny to be in His family. Because we're called to be the bride of Christ. So, as Dan and his dad worked together, they defeated the mother alien. They went back to Dan's home, and now reconciled with his father, Dan includes his dad in his own family. And so he ends up redeeming himself from his own future and forgives his father for the wounds that his dad brought upon him in his own childhood. And that undoes the chaos in his own heart that would have led to his own future annihilation of his family. And if all of us would do that in our own individual lives, that would prevent us from our whole society being corrupted and falling into chaos and nihilism. So I just found that to be very profound, just touched on so many symbolic points. So let me know if you had any thoughts about the movie. Maybe you just thought, it's just a fun action flick, a good fun time. Sure. But I saw some very deep themes there, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. All right, so join me in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and until next time, God bless.